Hey guys, it's Bree here at Blossom and Branch Farm, and today I thought I'd take you on a quick tour of our regenerative farm, so let's go. So I'm going to start here at the front of the farm. What we have over here is actually our perennial food garden. So when we started the farm, there was really nothing here. This was all a grassy area, and this is really an experimental spot just to see what we could do with the existing soil. So this is totally unamended soil. It was mostly grass when we started and a lot of weeds as well. So this is just our pure native soil, which is pretty heavy clay. And we did amend it with a little bit of alfalfa fertilizer. You can go back and watch the video on how we mounded up these beds just to help with the drainage of that clay. Now, right now, we're actually getting ready to turn this over and to start cover cropping into these beds. By cover cropping into the existing plants, or those plants that are kind of starting to fade here toward the end of the season, we're able to really get some soil health back into this clay soil, some organic matter, and yet we're able to keep these things growing because, as you can see, we still have foxglove, we still have cucumbers and peppers producing in here, so we're gonna leave those cover crop around it. But we have asparagus, we have potatoes in here, we have raspberries back here, and usually just anything I want to quickly grab from the house is up here, kind of the kitchen garden area. And also obviously our greenhouse is back there where we start most of our seeds. It's nice that this is close to the house because power, water in the winter are always issues. So the closer to the house I can be with my greenhouse, the better. Let's pan around this way so you can see a couple of our native meadow areas. So if you remember in our last tour, we were showing the meadow, but every year the meadow fills out more and more, and we get more and more things blooming. So we have been adjusting it a little bit because we really wanted to have more flowers in this space and a little bit less grass. So every year we're actually planting in some of those flowers. You can see the rudbeckia, echinacea, asters, a lot of this agastache, hummingbird mint, sedum. This is all drought tolerant, and that's because we really can't water this very well. What we did in this area was we did put in sprinkler heads to help with the establishment of these natives, and you can see one of them down here, but these native plants also grow really, really tall, and so you can see that these asters have now totally grown up and around the sprinkler head. It's really ineffective. It really doesn't work at all. If you want to do a tall meadow like this, you really want to put in something taller like a wobbler sprinkler head so that you can get all of the plants. Now, luckily these are all drought tolerant, so we don't really have to worry about watering them, but it's something to think about at least for the first couple of years. Now, this is really a spot that the birds love to be in, especially in the mornings. We have lots of wild sunflowers growing in here that just self-seed, and the finches love eating all those seeds. Over here to the left, this is more of a grassy meadow area. So we have a lot of switchgrass in here. We have some of the oats left over from when we actually cover cropped this area. So we did cover crop this the first year just to help with weed suppression. And then we direct seeded all of these grasses. So by direct seeding native grasses, we're saving money because plugs can be pretty expensive on this scale, and I can sow them much more thickly. So it helps a lot with weed prevention in those first couple of years, rather than planting in plugs and then having to weed around them. This area is also a great bird habitat. So birds really like thick grass areas because it's really good for hiding in. There's a lot of ground nesting birds that enjoy this space. So having it right here, right off of our flower field is really helpful because they help with our pest control. So speaking of the field, let's move over to that space. All right, so down here on the end, now I talked last year about possibly removing these roses, and to be honest, I never got around to it, so here they are. We did plant them in with onions. You might remember that last year we had them in with our onions and our garlic, and that was in an effort to help with the Japanese beetle populations. We also have some root-dwelling soil pests here, like root knot nematode, that I've found in some of these rose bushes. So we wanted to plant an allium because alliums are actually the only proven interplanting plant that will be effective. That's the one that has any scientific evidence behind it, is alliums, so things like garlic and onions, especially with soil-dwelling pests like root knot nematodes. So that's why we planted these onions and garlic into this space. It seems to be helping with the nematodes, not so much with the Japanese beetles. I went ahead and cut them all down this week, and then I mulched in between the roses with the onion tops, so we'll see if that helps at all. But remember from our tulip planting video that if you're planting bulbs this fall, try putting some garlic cuttings or some onion tops on top of your bed or in with your bulbs. It helps keep the squirrels from digging them up. We're gonna go back over here to this side of the field and then we'll come back to this side. Over here we have our peony field. So we've talked about peony growing in the past, whether or not it's profitable. And as you remember, I did say that yes, I do think peony growing is worthwhile if you're doing this on a cut flower growing scale, like as a market farm, or if you're trying to produce and sell. Yes, I think peonies are worth it, but I wouldn't put all of your eggs into the peony basket because we've had many seasons where we've gotten a late frost, or we've gotten a late snow, or we've gotten what else? Or we've gotten hail, or just not great peony production. So if you have all of your eggs in that basket of peonies and you have a crop failure, you can run into a lot of trouble. And so a couple of the other things that we do with the peonies is we don't do plastic mulches, which a lot of farmers do. Instead, we focus on using organic mulches. So a lot of wood chips in here. We also have some low-growing creeping phlox in here. And we've also interplanted this area with a lot of native plants because peonies are non-native. We always want to make sure we have biodiversity happening. In the walkways here, you'll see that we have native grasses. So blue grama in my area is a native grass. It's also drought tolerant. So it's really great for my walkways because we don't get very much rain. I think we're looking at 8 inches for this year so far. So we need something in the walkways that we don't have to water and that isn't going to creep too much. So blue grama is pretty good for that, we've found. Over here, we're back into the flower field, and now I mix in my annuals with my perennials. And you can also see that we've got some cover cropping growing in here. So obviously, because we do a lot of regeneratively focused stuff, we are wanting to do cover cropping as often as possible. So whenever we have a row, so for example, if we were growing something like stock or snapdragons that tend to terminate early, especially once it gets really, really hot, then we'll switch those beds over to a cover crop so that we don't have anything sitting bare. That way we're keeping our microbial life happy, and we're also adding more organic matter, which is always really important in our clay soil, but also is important for sandy soils. I have my last crop of zinnias growing in here. So you can remember that we seeded this zinnia into a cover crop residue of hairy vetch, and that residue was really, really thick, and now it's gotten broken down already pretty well by the microbes, but there's still enough here to shade the soil and also to help retain moisture. Now we do have some weeds that pop up in here, but again, because we're retaining moisture with this mulch, they're pretty easy to pull up. I do have to thin these zinnias today, so that is on my list, but these guys will be producing here in probably about 2 weeks, 2-3 weeks maybe. So we'll still get blooms from these before last frost, and these are all kind of fall toned, so golds and yellows. Now behind me, we've got our Lisianthus, and they are getting ready to bloom. So if you are a fellow Lisianthus lover, you will want to remember that you have to have patience with these flowers. So it's mid-August. These are actually late for us this year, but I did plant them late because we were so busy this spring. But they are looking good. They are getting ready to bloom. But one interesting thing I want to point out is the difference in the Lisianthus over on this side and the Lisianthus on the end of the row. So this was a little experiment that I ran this year, and I wanted to see if the wool made a difference. So you guys know that we've done a lot of experiments with wool in seed starting and found that the wool helps a lot with the growth and just the general health of the seedlings. But I wanted to know, does it help when they're actually planted into the field? So the Lisianthus down on that side that are significantly taller and look like they're budding a little bit earlier, I surrounded by wool as I was planting them into their holes. These ones down here on the end had no wool. So that is the only difference. Other than that, all the varieties are mixed. So it's a pretty good representation across different varieties of how that wool impacts the growth of the plants. Again, because that wool is providing two things: moisture retention and slow release nitrogen. So I think between those two things, definitely worth that little bit of extra time. It maybe took me 2 extra seconds to wrap each one with a little bit of raw wool, pop it into the hole. Hey, I don't know, give it a shot. All right, over here we've got some cover crop growing. So this is a buckwheat, peas, and oats mix. We're gonna let our sheep come in here and graze this down here probably in about 2 to 3 weeks once it's at flowering stage. And we have one more row of cover crop growing, but remember in here we've got our golden currants. So I always like to point these out because those golden currants are so important to our pest management system. Because what they do is they attract birds, and not only because of the berries of the golden currants, but also because it's habitat. So we've often found little birds nesting and hopping around in here, especially in the mornings or in the evenings when I come out to the field. They're usually within these hedgerows. So we have 2 of them spaced in the field. They also help a little bit with wind block. And then if I plant something that prefers cooler temperatures or a little bit of shade, I can plant them on the east side of these plants, and they get that little bit of shade in the afternoon, which is what I've got over on the other side. So let's take a look. So here you can see I've got snapdragons. Again, snapdragons preferring a little bit cooler temperatures. Now we do grow some that are more heat tolerant, like the rocket and Potomac's, which don't mind the heat as much as a madam butterfly or a chantilly. Those snapdragons don't like heat, but they still like a little bit of afternoon shade. So putting them on this side of the hedgerow is helpful. These ones are done for the season, so we're going to go ahead and cut these down this week, which is always a sad day because they are still blooming, but they're past their prime really for cutting. And really in previous seasons we would have never had this many blooming at once, but because we're photographing for our book right now, we've let them bloom. And getting down toward here, we've got our dahlias. These ones are just starting to bloom. These ones are a little bit later than our other dahlias. And these are all overwintered dahlias. So as you recall, we do overwinter all of our dahlias just because we find it helps them survive. Honestly, I have stored dahlias over and over and over again. I've tried so many different ways of storing them, but I just don't have the patience really or the time over the winter to really dedicate to dahlias. And so I found that storing them in the ground just works better. You can go back and watch our video on how we do that here in our zone 5-6 if you're interested in trying it. But this is actually my favorite variety here. This is Wine-Eyed Jill. And I love Wine-Eyed Jill because it comes in so many different peachy tones, and it's our earliest bloomer, and it also has the tallest stems. So it's just a great mix of all kinds of different pros. Now, they are thin stemmed, so that's the only downside of this dahlia, but for a garden dahlia, really pretty. Another row of cover crops. We've got some more annuals here, and this year we've been mixing in a lot more stuff together. So previous years we've done a row of something and a row of something else. I really wanted to get some more biodiversity going in between my rows, so we just got a lot of stuff going here, and you can see that we've got feverfew, rudbeckia, bee balm, calendula, anise hyssop, asters, just all kinds of things going in here. That does make it a little bit harder to walk up and down the walkways, but visually I think our customers enjoy it a lot more. All right, behind me here you can see an area of our field that's really more dedicated to perennials. Now we do still have annuals mixed in here, but I just found that clumping my perennials together makes it easier for cover cropping. So while I do like to cover crop, I always like to give the caveat that if you're growing on a market farm or for production scale, it's easier to cover crop if you're growing all of your annuals in one space, because trying to cover crop in and amongst perennials is time consuming and a little bit harder than just knocking down a whole row of annuals and cover cropping, if that makes any sense. But back here we kind of have a little bit of a jungle. So we have oregano growing in here, which makes a really beautiful cut. This is Rocky Mountain bee plant. So this one is a native, and you can see it kind of serves as a trap crop. We have a lot of little holes. This tends to be flea beetles that eat the leaves of this one. But because they're eating the leaves of this, they're leaving my snapdragons and all my other flowers alone that they normally would like to eat. You can see the little seeds here look like little bean pods. Speaking of pollination, let's pop over to this side. Okay, this is the jungle I call the pumpkin tunnel. And you can see we have some more self-sown sunflowers here guarding the door. But I've just really found that I love growing pumpkins this way. So these are growing up and around our cattle panel greenhouse. So in the winters previously, we have actually grown stuff in this space. I didn't last year because we had no water, but we could cover this space and use it as a tunnel, and it's really, really strong. One of the questions I get is, do I have to support the pumpkins growing in here? And the answer is no, I don't. What I found is that if the pumpkins are already growing on the vine like this, the vine just thickens and the stem thickens to hold the weight of the pumpkin. So I don't have to do any extra work, but if you're worried about your pumpkins falling, if you're growing them on an arbor, you can put them in a little hammock. I just don't. Let's take one last look over here at the field just to check out some of the other things we have growing. So a lot of native perennials down here on this end of the field. As you know, we are really focusing on natives here at the farm. So we've got echinacea here, we have solid aster. This is actually a cultivar, which is a blend of solidago and aster. We have our other overwintered dahlias. These ones are looking just so huge and tall this year. I'm not sure why, but hey. We've got some borage that's self-seeded and we need to cut back before it self-seeds again. But just like your garden, sometimes things get out of control and then I decide to leave it because it looks so cute. Oh, look, yeah. Our first cafe au lait this season. Oh, these are the flowers that made me fall in love with dahlias. They're not the best for vase life. Dinner plate dahlias tend to be pretty rough on vase life, but I feel like their beauty for the 3 days that they make it in the vase makes up for it. Again, you'll see just a mix of a lot of different things down here on this end. We also have onions, we have some herbs growing here in and amongst all these flowers, and we have our tomatoes, of course. So I always love a good cherry tomato. Sun golds are my favorite. Now, I will say I planted my tomatoes in this spot for 3 years now, so really next year I need to move them, but this is so convenient to use this old fence post as our trellis guide because it's already in place and I didn't have to build anything, and I always love that. But these tomatoes are looking pretty good. We're getting a little bit of leaf curl, so again, I do need to move them for next year just because as we plant them in the same spot, they can get more subject to diseases. But you have to see how big these ones are. Ah, down here, look at these huge tomatoes. We also have some more peonies growing back in here, as you can see. And some more prickly lettuce. There is a really popular clematis called Sweet Autumn, and Sweet Autumn clematis actually happens to be invasive. This is the native option, Clematis virginiana. So same pretty white flowers, same beautiful vining habit. I really need to train it to climb up and over this, but non-invasive, native, still spreads, still climbs, but at least it's not an invasive variety. And then over here we have our barns. If you've watched our videos before, we do a lot of our videos out of this space. We also do workshops and things out of here. So we've got a little bloom happening on our clematis climbing the side there. And those have morning sun and then afternoon shade, which is most clematis' favorite, except for these native clematis, which really like full sun. All right, let's move over and see the sheep, and then I'm going to show you what I was telling you about the squash vine borer. This is where midnight nerds hang out. Because if they hang out too close to the house, they do this every time they see me, and they're loud. Hey boys! Pink. So right next to that pumpkin tunnel, we have these plants growing. So this half of the property, it's really about a half an acre, is really dedicated to wildlife habitat, bird habitat. And so we have a lot of these plants growing. So we have American plums growing in here, and we also have a lot of choke cherries. The reason that I like to plant my pumpkin tunnel and my squashes right next to this is because the #1 predator of squash vine borer is birds. So the more birds we have over here in this space, the less issues we have with squash vine borer. And actually, whenever I planted them here, I've never had any. So if you don't already have some berry producing plants in your garden that are just dedicated for the birds, and some water ideally for those birds in the summer, it will help a lot with any of those issues. Also various caterpillars and things eating down your garden. Try that before you start resorting to any pesticides. Let's head back here. Now, when we bought this property, this was so overgrown. We couldn't even walk past here. And so we started out actually removing a lot of invasive trees. You can see one here that we still have to take down. This is Siberian elm. And first of all, they look terrible because there's these little bugs that like to eat them. But also they are weak trees, so they just grow tall and then they die and then they fall. And they also spread and sucker, and they're non-native. So we've been systematically taking them down, but it's expensive to do that. So we do a little bit every year. Over here we've got currants as well. So we don't only have the American plums, we also have choke cherries. We have some wild currants growing in here, also a great bird plant. And then every year I try to reclaim a little bit more of this space with native plants. So we're really letting it be pretty wild other than trying to remove the invasive plants. And we're also trying to bring in native ground cover. So I've been seeding a lot of blue grama in here. So you can see I usually focus on kind of one area per year to seed with that blue grama. And then I do another area the next year just because we're limited on water back here. And it needs water to establish. I've just learned that I can do one chunk at a time. But lots of plums in here. They make a really great syrup and a really good jam as well. Finally sweet. They're still really tart, but they make a really good syrup. So really, you can see how we let this area just be really wild and overgrown. Lots of sunflowers over here too. We have a bit of a chaos forest that I planted back here. My kids' fort. So this is an area I've been kind of wanting to work on for so many years, and I just have a hard time dedicating time. And also we still have invasive suckers that come up in here. This is what happens if we don't treat any of the invasives that we cut down. We really need to cut and paint the stumps with a systemic herbicide, because otherwise they do just do this. They resprout and spread. But we did do blue tansy in here, which is just starting to fade and go to seed. And blue tansy is a really cool native plant. It's really pretty, and the bumblebees love it when it's all in bloom. So this is all blue tansy. It really kind of served as a cover crop this year. Blue tansy, buckwheat, some squashes in here, sunflowers. We have a black walnut that sprouted up in here that we're letting grow. Again, the focus back here is really on just trying to control the invasives. So we're still working on that back here. More to come on this one, probably next year. All right, let's pop over to the chickens. All right, over here's our chicken coop. And we have 3 chickens right now, hoping to adopt some more. We just had some wildfires come through Colorado, and so a lot of people had to actually give their chickens to the Humane Society, and so they're looking for people to adopt them, so we might grab some more. Oh. Hello. Some of you might have seen our Cordelia got sick a couple weeks ago, and we had to take her to the vet, and the vet recommended a chicken CT scan, and the treatment course is going to cost like $2,500. Anyway, she's fine now. We didn't do the chicken CAT scan, but she's fine. Thanks. So the chickens do help us, because if we're getting a lot of grasshoppers, in the past we've let them out into the field, and they love chasing down grasshoppers. Now this year, for whatever reason, we just haven't had that many grasshoppers at all. And this is actually the first year I would say that's the case. And everyone else in our area is having a lot of grasshopper issues. So my thought is that it's due to our ecosystem finally kicking in here at the farm here in year 5. The birds helping pick off those grasshoppers. And I think the grasshoppers really prefer the grassy space over the flowers. So we're finding all these things finally working together, again, helping reduce our pest population. But that being said, we're not immune to pests at all. In fact, we still get things like Japanese beetles. Sometimes, especially the non-native pests, you just have to roll with and just realize that they're going to be part of the garden. The last thing I'm going to show you is up front, which is the lavender field. I'm going to put these eggs down. Let's head up there. All right, we're up here at the lavender field now. We did some U-pick events this year with the lavender. So we are actually fading here on these blooms. We're still gonna harvest these even though they're a little bit past harvest stage. I'm not sure what I'm gonna do with them all this year. Maybe make some wreaths, or we usually do some like scented sachets and some other things like that. But this year again was kind of a year where we were just letting things be what they were, and these provide great forage for bumblebees. The lavender is also super drought tolerant, so we never watered this space at all. We did in year 1, this is now year 3, and we haven't watered these at all this year. Now the grass in the walkways is looking pretty rough. This is actually perennial rye, and it's perennial rye that the sheep like to eat. So we can grow this lavender regeneratively. We have the sheep come through and they graze the walkways, and in the meantime they poop and they improve the soil up here. It's also pretty. It encourages our community to come by and talk, and it spurs conversation about drought tolerant lawns, which I always like to do. I also like to talk about invasives with my neighbors, so I can kind of start that conversation based off me being out here and working in the lavender field as people are walking by. So I always love that community piece of regenerative gardening, regenerative agriculture. That really is a key piece that we often forget. So that's kind of where this lavender field comes in. It's pretty, it's drought tolerant, and it gets our neighbors and our community out here and talking. We're gonna wrap. We've got to get to market. We've got a U-pick this morning, so we're gonna get to work. And thanks for tuning in here. See you guys around here next time at the farm.